Welcome back to the Muse Capital podcast. In this series, we're talking about the future of how we care. On this episode, we're thrilled to welcome Marina Pavlovic, a data scientist turned entrepreneur as the founder of Eli Health. Eli is on a mission to improve lifelong women's health by continuously monitoring hormones via saliva. Today, we're diving into a topic that often feels like a black box: hormones. Despite their critical role in our health, many of us just don't understand how hormones dictate our bodies. Eli Health is here to shed light on this topic and help us better understand the impact hormones have on our health. And joining us today on this episode, we also have our principal, Maria de Santis. Maria has been an integral part of Muse Capital for 5 years. She holds a master's in entrepreneurship and innovation from USC and has valuable experience in business development at an early stage company in Europe. Maria is the one who helped source the Eli Health deal, so we're excited to have her join us and hear her questions and perspective. Hey Marina, it is so great to have you today. We are such huge fans of Eli. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much for having me.
And Maria, thank you for letting us steal you from the office and get you into the podcast studio. You are, after all, an integral part of all of this. And on that note, how about you kick us off today?
Thank you so much, Asya. I'm so excited to be on this episode with you both. And I want to start from the very beginning here, Marina. Please tell us a little bit more about yourself, your background, and most importantly, why did you start Eli Health?
So Eli started initially from a personal need. I was at a point in my life where I was looking for a different contraception method. I had tried many different methods and experienced different symptoms. And when I started digging deeper into it, I saw how, for me, hormonal contraception was driving some of those symptoms. And as I was in the process of trying to find alternatives, speaking with other women around me, I saw that there was a big dissatisfaction around the methods they were using. But most importantly, over that process, I quickly realized that the dissatisfaction that women were experiencing around contraception were also showing around other life stages when it came to fertility, to perimenopause, to endocrine conditions that they were experiencing. By speaking with hundreds of women, we realized that the gap that was constant across all of those stories was how hormones were driving many of the conditions and transitions that we were experiencing, and how we had not really any way to understand what was happening. And as a data scientist, being used to leverage numbers to make decisions, I found that there was something that was not feeling right in not being able to have the necessary information to make decisions around my own health. So that's really how the journey started, into being able to have the frequency of data that matches the frequency at which hormone fluctuates.
It's incredible to have a test like this available. So how does Eli work? Walk us through the mechanics and where the results come and what I can see as I'm using it.
For sure. I have a test here, so I'll be able to show you in real time. So the full process is very simple. You have a pouch with your test in that pouch. And when you take out the test, there's 3 steps. First, you put the cartridge on your tongue for 30 seconds. You pull on the strip. You take a picture of your test 20 minutes after the time it develops. And then you receive your results on your mobile app in the format of a dashboard where you see your hormone fluctuations, your score, your measurement, and you see those metrics for different hormones. Right now, it's cortisol and progesterone, but we do have a pipeline of more than a dozen hormones for the future.
It's very exciting. And Marina, can you tell us a little bit more about the use cases of this technology? From menstruation to menopause, walk us through the different personas that can use Eli and how it helps them to track hormones.
If we take a step back, hormones influence both men and women. But when it comes to women's health, hormones impact us differently. and it drives conditions that affect us predominantly. So it's for that reason that we're starting with a focus on women's health, and hormones drive many of the conditions and transitions that we experience across our life. We're starting with a focus around perimenopause, fertility, and what we call general health, which is how hormones impact our physical and mental health. And those two hormones I've mentioned, cortisol and progesterone, play a huge role on all areas of our health. It goes way beyond reproduction. Sometimes when we think of hormones for women, we think of fertility, and it's true that there's a huge impact there, but it goes way beyond that. So being able to measure hormones continuously over time can enable people and women to have a much greater control on all of those transitions and conditions that they can experience.
Marina, we're curious as to why people haven't tackled this problem in the past.
Yeah, there's multiple factors that play into that. And I love to do the comparison with other biomarkers, such as heart rate. When we look back 10 years ago, to measure our heart rate, we needed to go at the doctor's office or maybe at the pharmacy with those bulky tools that you had to put your arms in and get the result a couple minutes after. Right now, we have it on our wrist at all times, and we're able to make decisions based on that information. And when it comes to hormones, it's a similar dynamic that hormones fluctuates continuously, but we're still today using those legacy tools that enables infrequent snapshots. And part of the reason why is due to the technical difficulty of creating a tool, a technology that enables to measure hormone continuously. Because to make that happen, you need something that is low cost and that provides real-time results. And for us, it was a 5 years journey of R&D, more than 12 inventions. And those inventions span across the chemistry of the test, the microfluidic necessary to collect the saliva, the AI component that interprets the saliva. So it's a highly complex technology that is very multidisciplinary, so that there's that part that plays into account. But culturally as well, there's a big shift over how we speak about hormones and the awareness of the role of hormones.
Yep. And I think we can speak to that because at Muse Capital, we've been looking for this solution. We like to identify white spaces in women's health before people know about them. 5 years ago, it was menopause. And when we met you a few years ago, we knew that there was this wide open space for continuous hormone testing. And so the reason why we got so excited when Maria met you was because we heard that you were doing this through saliva. We immediately were like, oh, well, that's not very accurate. But then, as we got to know you, we understood, how deep you'd gone in terms of R&D, the kind of clinical trials, and the results that you were getting were extraordinary. So maybe you can talk to that, kind of what were your results that were coming out of your clinical trials and your R&D versus what was already on the market.
And the difference, I would add to that also, the difference between saliva testing and urine or blood and the accuracy dynamics there.
Initially, it started with the vision of making continuous hormone monitoring possible. So then the question was, what is the best way to do that, to create an experience that we can use every day? And our benchmark was brushing your teeth. We wanted something at least as easy so that we can integrate it into our daily lives. And that's how we came across the possibility of using saliva. And the first question that comes up often, given that it's not a traditional way of testing, is the accuracy of measuring saliva. So that's one of the very first things we've done when we explored that path, was to do a study. We've partnered with McGill University on that to do a systematic review on all the results and research that was made on the correlation between saliva and blood. And the conclusion of the study showed that there's a really strong correlation between saliva and blood. So the results of those studies show that saliva is as valid as blood to measure hormones. So then the challenge becomes not the biological relevance of saliva, but the technical difficulty of measuring saliva. And that's the result of our IP, with which we're able to measure very, very low levels of hormones in saliva. And we've also done a correlation study to show how our product compares to gold standard with more than 90% accuracy. So I would say the main gap on the market today, it's not necessarily accuracy. Because when we look at, for example, ship-to-lab tests that ask you to take a sample at home, it can be blood, it can be saliva, urine, you ship it back to the lab. Those are accredited labs with very accurate tests. So the gap is not that accuracy, it's the frequency at which we can access the data.
Marina, tell us about how we at Muse met Eli Health.
So we met initially through one of our existing investors, if I remember correctly, and more precisely, Maria reaching out to them. And what I remember is that from the start, I was so surprised around how that process went, because when I spoke with Maria, she told me that the team was actively looking for a technology like that one because the team had identified the gap on the market. So for a founder, that's something extremely exciting to hear, that potential investors had seen that gap in the same way that you did. And that really kicked off that relationship around that gap that we both realized was existing.
Yeah, and I remember, our team had spent months and months looking under the hood of hormonal wellness, and the whole team had spoken to multiple companies building in a hormonal health space. We've spoken to companies doing it via urine, via blood, but we really understood that the gap was not necessarily in the accuracy of the data, but it was in the frequency and the accessibility to this data. And so when we met you, and really saw that you were providing this everyday testing and really accessible from the comfort of your home, I knew that, it was something different.
I think that what was very impressive for us is, we'd already done the deep dive on the research of the space in terms of the market, but it was us looking for defensibility around what you were building in particular. And we knew that there were other companies out there that were claiming to do something very similar, but they didn't necessarily have the kind of clinical data and results from the studies that you were able to secure before raising your seed round. And that's what we found really defensible and super exciting about Eli, because it's not something that someone else can start overnight. As you know, I think something really fascinating about your company, and this is incredible for the fact that you are a Canadian company and you have the support of the government, who also believe in this space, was the fact that they were providing non-dilutive capital to help you in those clinical trials. And I think that was, super important in terms of your journey, but also in your defensibility.
Exactly. And as a founder, there's nothing more powerful than having investors that truly see the need and truly see the vision. And especially when it comes to building a technology that has never existed before, it takes time. And to have that patience as IP is being created, as regulatory approval are being gained, it requires that vision and deep understanding of the need to appreciate how that time and process is necessary to get there.
Maybe we can take a step back and have a little mini Hormone 101 specifically around the women's cycle. I know it's something we've started to learn ourselves through this process, and it's just fascinating how much we've learned and how we're in our 40s learning these things. So I'd love the listeners today to just get a basic rundown of how our cycle works, and then, of course, more specifically, how progesterone and cortisol are affected through that process, since that's the first two tests that we'll be able to test with through Eli.
So the cycle is 4 different phases. There's the first phase that is the follicular phase, and the second one that is the luteal phase. And we also have menstruations and premenstrual phase in that cycle. And when it comes to estradiol, it's predominant in the first half of the cycle and progesterone in the second half of the cycle. And as those hormones fluctuates, it drives some of the biological processes in our bodies. So for example, ovulation, but it drives much more than that. It drives how we feel on a daily basis and the type of lifestyle that we should have during those phases. And progesterone is often referred to as the calming hormone. However, it's very impacted by stress. And that's why we have to look at hormones not individually. Because, for example, when it comes to stress, cortisol, known as the stress hormone, plays a role that goes much beyond stress response. For example, by impacting how progesterone fluctuates. So when we take a step back and look at cortisol, it has a daily rhythm instead of a monthly one. In the morning, cortisol rises as you wake up, and it decreases slowly over the day to reach its lowest level at night to prepare you for sleep. Sometimes when we think of cortisol, we think of lowering cortisol, but sometimes it's as important to increase it to reach that morning peak and then make sure it stays low at night. And by different lifestyle changes that you can implement, it does not only balances those levels for cortisol, but has a rippling effect on other hormones like progesterone.
Cortisol is an interesting one, as you say. It fluctuates throughout the day versus the other hormones like progesterone and estrogen are throughout the cycle. But if you wake up in the morning and your cortisol is not as high as it should be, then you know you'll have to make dietary changes in your breakfast, or maybe you need to prioritize going out for a walk first thing in the morning. And possibly if it happens once or twice here and there, it's not an issue. But if you see that there is something more continuous and you're testing those levels throughout the weeks and months, and it's always like that, you know there's something off. And as you said, cortisol will then throw off all the other hormones in your system. So in the 4 phases of the menstruation, the week before our period, where is progesterone in that moment?
Right before PMS, so in the second phase of the cycle, progesterone rises and then it starts declining. And when there's that decrease, that's where the PMS phase is starting, premenstrual phase, where we can experience a variety of symptoms, and it's correlated with that decrease of progesterone.
I think that's important because sometimes we, as women, feel a certain way. And of course, some of us have the Flow app or just tracking our periods, but we're always having we can have a bad day and then you don't know what's going on. And you go, oh, right, I'm 3-4 days before my period. But understanding how exactly those hormones work is essential in really understanding our own bodies and how we can make changes. For example, the week before your period, it was never told to me that that's the one time you shouldn't be doing strenuous exercise. That as you say, progesterone is the calming hormone and you're more sensitive to stress. And so low impact exercising is ideal for that time. There's specific diets that work better in certain cycle moments or others. So I find it fascinating, but it's interesting to know when some people say, oh, I don't suffer from PMS. And then one of us will say, yeah, we suffer from it. And I'm sure if we were taking Eli tests, we would have an understanding of why one person is suffering more than another.
I think that a key point here is that information is power, right? At the moment, we're in the dark as women. We're just expected to get on with our daily lives when actually these hormones are having a pretty fundamental effect. And this is just typical of the women's health space in general. I feel like us and our mothers, etc., all were just forced to sort of just shut up and deal with it. And that's just ridiculous and something that we're very passionate about fixing, and honestly why we do what we do. Having that data, having that insight that something like Eli would provide could be very life-changing for a lot of women around the world.
Speaking of data, women were excluded from clinical trials until 1993. I say that slowly because it is absolutely shocking. Until 1993, we had no test of our bodies on what Tylenol does to us, what antidepressants does to our body, general medication, pharma, all of it. And it's because, and there are articles, public medical sheets, papers published, saying that the reason why is that women's hormones are pesky. I mean, the word pesky was used in medical documentation describing our wonderfully ever-evolving, beautifully cyclical bodies. And of course, those pesky hormones get in the way of lab data, and it's sophisticated and it requires sophisticated analysis and collecting, and it's more expensive to collect all that data. So it is a black box because this data that you're collecting is really the first of its kind. And it's one of the main reasons as investors that we're extremely excited about it, because the IP, the data is fundamental. Anyway, fascinating and turning tide for women's health for sure.
When it comes to clinical trials and exclusion of women in those trials, there's a piece that touches on the social aspect of discrimination, but there's another piece that's related to what people refer to as the complexity of hormones. And scientists want as much as possible to control variables, to have systems that are constant, to be able to see, for example, the effect on a drug by controlling all of the other variables. So when you have hormones that fluctuate continuously and constantly, it becomes very hard to know what's happening because you don't have that data. And without having that data, then the conclusion that you're making for your main question in that trial may be perceived as bias. But ultimately, that exclusion, once you have the necessary tools to be able to collect the data, becomes irrelevant. So that's why we're extremely excited about being able to create this data set for the first time, because it enables an understanding of hormones that goes beyond what we ever had. But that goes also beyond hormones, because with that information, we're now able to measure many different areas of health and many other interventions in a way that's properly controlled.
And I think on that point, it is just having the data in the first place. I gave birth to my daughter like 7 months ago. I've been breastfeeding the whole time. I'm starting to wean on breastfeeding, and my hormones are going crazy, completely crazy. And I always say to myself, oh, wouldn't it be wonderful if I knew that this was coming right now? And that's not just for me coming off of breastfeeding. That's for general PMS, for breast cancer. It's for, we are individual beings and all of our hormones are very different. But wouldn't it be awesome to just have an idea that, oh, this is what's going on with my hormones. I'm probably going to feel this way and I will do X, Y, Z.
Yeah.
I mean,
So
it's extraordinary that this is only being resolved now, thankfully, because of entrepreneurs like yourselves.
And empowering.
And I also want to say that the gap that you're filling in hormonal care, it's so important, but there are still so many other conditions that affect both in women, but disproportionately women that we don't have an understanding of, such as Alzheimer's disease, heart disease. And so at Muse, we're continuing to look into the women's health space to understand what are the companies that are tackling these problems that affect disproportionately women. I think migraines is another one that, most people who suffer from migraines are women, very little understanding of why that is and the solutions. And so we're continuing to look at other areas that are critical to our well-being and can help us feel our best.
I mean, you mentioned migraines. I have some friends who suffer debilitating migraines and no one has an answer for it. Imagine tracking your hormones and then getting a migraine and being able over the course of weeks, months, understand a pattern. And you start seeing that possibly there's a hormone correlation to it. And which hormone is it? And why? And when? I mean, it's, again, we are self-diagnosing ourselves. We're taking medicine into our own hands.
And I think that's what women do, right? We self-diagnose ourselves very, very often. And I think with hormonal health, it's 80% of women who suffer from hormonal imbalances. And so the scale that Eli can reach is really massive.
Exactly.
Can you tell we're excited?
And you've all touched on different aspects of the same problem, the lack of data. And having that data enables you to make decisions without being in the dark, whether it comes to knowing what's coming. In the example you've mentioned, Rachel, to be able to know how those future fluctuations will impact how you will feel in a few days, in a few weeks, but eventually in a few years too, because there's some early research showing that how hormone fluctuates today can predict the severity of symptoms in the future when it comes, for example, to menopause. So what can you do today to avoid those conditions from appearing in the future? And same when it comes to medication, taking different medication at different moments of the cycle, how it could impact your health differently. We can make a parallel with sports, for example, where if you do high intensity training around ovulation, where you're at your peak energy, versus if you do that same exercise right before your menstruation or during, your body won't react in the same way. And that's why having this data then enables not only you as an individual, but also the medical and research community to know how to leverage the cycle.
I'm so glad you mentioned exercise and physical exercise. We have Dawn Scott coming on the podcast. She is the head of performance and medicine for Washington Spirit, the women's soccer team that we invested in a few years ago. She's an expert in women's sports, and she was one of the first really to identify what is so clearly obvious to us, that hormones are important to track for female athletes in order to increase their level of performance, decrease their odds of injury, which is essential. And of course, what you said is exactly true. It's knowing that what kind of exercises to do at which moment in time and in your cycle. And there's a lot of information that we can extrapolate for all of our active lives that now, luckily for the growth of women's sports, is adding attention and more data into that precise issue.
Speaking about the future and where this can go, Marina, I have a burning question about advances in technology, things like artificial intelligence, which appear to be everywhere. Do you want to touch on that and how important a company like yours that's getting access to raw data will be to women's health and the advancement of AI going forward?
As a data scientist, this is a topic that is close to my heart. We're a company that is developing tests that measure hormones, but at the core, we're mostly a data company because the test is the way to collect the data. Ultimately, the value comes from the data itself. And right now, we're already using artificial intelligence. The most exciting opportunity will come through the first data set that we will be creating of large-scale, longitudinal, high-frequency fluctuations of hormones. So leveraging AI will be able to tell you individually what's your unique pattern, but at the large scale, we'll be able to get a view of hormones that we never had before. So that means advancements in different treatments, advancement in personalized health interventions, and also proactive care. And when we see how medicine is evolving, going from a reactive approach to one that is proactive, you cannot be proactive without data. And that's when the data set itself and how you're going to process it will be core to the future.
It's fascinating. I mean, AI is only as good as the input that you're putting into it, right? And actually, part of the lack of data in women's health since 1993 has affected the amount of data. And that's why AI systems for women's health are still highly broken. And the data that we have from 1993 is super biased as well. So it's really unusable, most of it. So it's really, we're in this new era of data that Eli is really taking a leading position in. And just practically speaking, imagine starting to take Eli in your premenstrual phase. If you imagine giving your teenage daughter Eli and tracking her for 20, 30, 40 years, what I would have done to be able to have that kind of data and AI on it, it's just going to give us incredible insights. And it's going to shed light on, I think, some major things like why we're getting more and more cases of breast cancer, migraines, all the different things that medicine has tried to prove for so long and tried to fix for so long. Thanks to this long-term data and AI-fueled data, we're going to be able to have answers to some of these big black boxes.
Exactly. And when we look at the data itself, the first phase is having real-time information. But as people collect this data over time and over years, we'll be able to tell the next generations what they can expect over the years. And that's extremely exciting for the future.
We know it's early days for Eli. We know that you have 5 years worth of IP, clinical data. That is why, we at Muse were really interested in the product. Just talk us through the potential of Eli and where it's going to go, not just from the consumer side, but also on the regulatory side. So taking it from a consumer lifestyle product into a medical device that can be used by clinicians moving forward.
When we started Eli, we had to make a decision between creating a purely consumer product or to take the route of a medical device. And we chose the route of medical device because our long-term vision is to be integrated within healthcare systems. So how that approach has driven our development is multifaceted. It drove the processes we had in place to build the product, how we've created the data to show the performance of the product. And this data is what we've used to complete our first regulatory phase, which enables us to sell direct to consumer. But we see it really ultimately as a first phase towards being able to go into the medical setting in the future.
And all this work that you've been doing the last 5 years, all this data, you've already knee deep in that process of regulatory in order to get to that clinical ultimate goal, which I know has been something that we've been particularly excited about from the very beginning. And it's just a matter of time that MIDI clients and your children's pediatrician and fertility clinics are going to end up, and hospitals just in general, are going to be able to use something like Eli. How far away are we in that process?
So for the initial stage of the consumer launch, all the regulatory work has been successfully completed. So we're very excited about that milestone. And when it comes to the future phase of clinical utility, that's a process that is not too far along in the roadmap and that we expect for next year. And to make that happen, we'll work hand in hand with providers to be able to generate the right data that will support those future approvals.
That is so exciting. Well, at Muse, we're going to help you get there in whichever way that we can. Now, I'm sure everybody who's listening wants Eli ASAP. When can they find it? Where can they buy it? And in the meantime, where can they find out more?
For anyone who's interested in having a clearer picture of what's happening in their body and having access to that hormonal data, the best way to stay informed is by joining our waitlist on our website, eli.health. And through that waitlist, you'll not only be the first one to know when the product is released, but also get valuable information when it comes to hormonal health.
Super exciting. Run, don't walk, to go get your Eli Health when it comes out. Thank you, Marina.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much for listening. Be sure to check out our show notes, and to find out more about Eli, go to eli.health. As always, you can find out more about us at musecapital.vc. Tune in to the next episode where we speak to Joanna Strober, the inspiring and preeminent CEO of MIDI Health, and we get to learn about why menopause is hot. Special thanks to our executive producer, Lauren Maddock, and our engineer and composer, John Meek. Ciao for now.